you admitted that the Emergencies Act was the wrong decision. In hindsight, what would have been the right decision?
Hey everyone, William Diaz here with Rebel News, and today I'll walk you through the extremely interesting testimony we heard from Rob Stewart and Dominique Rochon on the 22nd day of the Emergencies Act inquiry on November 14th. Before we begin, let's remember that the inquiry is taking place because Justin Trudeau invoked a never-seen-before anti-terrorism law on peaceful protesters who gathered in Ottawa from all across the country to protest his own COVID-19 mandate during Freedom Convoy 2022. You can see and support our independent coverage of this inquiry taking place here once again in Ottawa at truckercommission.com. The witnesses who appeared in front of the commission were Rob Stewart, Deputy Minister of Public Safety at the federal level, and one of his colleagues, Dominique Rochon, Senior Assistant Deputy Minister from the National and Cybersecurity Branch with Public Safety Canada. Now, Rob Stewart was working closely with the Liberal Cabinet and Marco Mendicino during the Freedom Convoy. Rob Stewart, his name appeared often since the beginning of the inquiry, but we finally had a chance to hear what he had to say in front of the commission. Before we began, Rob Stewart was the one who informed Marcel Baudin, the head of police liaison with the Ontario Provincial Police, the OPP, on February 13th, that the government would not meet with the protesters, even though Baudin strongly suggested that they do so. Baudin was the one who concocted a plan suggesting that the Liberal cabinet meet with the protesters, part of the Freedom Convoy. And that plan was presented to them, to the cabinet, the day prior to the invocation of the Emergencies Act. Then, remember this?
Did you know that that meeting was at 3:30 p.m. and that it was with cabinet and it was the incident response group of the political executive meeting and that your proposal was provided to them?
No.
Okay. It was. I can tell you that. And then they invoked the Emergencies Act. Thank you.
Now, Stewart and Rochon were grilled by Freedom Convoy lawyer Brendan Miller when undergoing cross-examination. Take a look at how this went.
That at no point did the service, being CSIS, assess the protests in Ottawa or elsewhere, those referred to as the Freedom Convoy and related protests and blockades in January and February 2022, constituted a threat to the security of Canada as defined in Section 2 of the CSIS Act, and that CSIS cannot investigate activities constituting lawful protests. CSIS assessed there was no indication of foreign state interference occurring in the course of the protest. CSIS did not assess that any foreign state supported the protest through funding, that foreign states deployed covert or overt disinformation techniques, or that any foreign state actors attempted to enter into Canada to support the protest. There, Director Vigneault states that he learned that the EA referenced the threat definitions set out in Section 2 of the CSIS Act once the federal government began to seriously consider invoking the EA between February 10th and 13th. He requested that the service prepare a threat assessment on the risks associated with the invocation of the EA. He felt an obligation to clearly convey the service's position that there did not exist a threat to the security of Canada as defined by the service's legal mandate. The threat assessment prepared by the service was that the invocation of the emergencies legislation risked further inflaming IMV rhetoric and individuals holding accelerationist or anti-government views. You were told that, is that correct?
That is correct.
This cross-examination by Miller shows that Stewart, Rochon, and their teams completely disregarded crucial CSIS intel in order to invoke the Emergencies Act. CSIS's opinion was that invoking the Act would radicalize protesters, and they didn't indicate it was crucial to do so. Stewart was unable to point to a reasonable authority that stated that the threshold under Section 2 of the CSIS Act was met. Here's the moment from Miller's cross-examination of the panel of two witnesses that completes this assessment.
Okay, so what intelligence bureau or agency or law enforcement agency told the government, here's the evidence of reasonable and probable grounds, or reasonable grounds, of a Section 2 CSIS Act threat? And you know, I take it now, because it's advised to you, that that's required to invoke the Emergencies Act. It's in the documents. You were advised of that.
Yes.
Right. So what agency gave you the evidence and the intelligence that said, hey, we have reasonable grounds of a Section 2 CSIS Act threat. There wasn't one, was there?
So let me explain. Nobody bringing advice to the table other than CSIS is assessing that against that threat. Nobody advising the cabinet. The cabinet is making that decision. And their interpretation of the law is what governs here and the advice they get. And their decision was, evidently, that the threshold was met.
Later, the Counsel for the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom, the GCCF, got his chance to cross-examine Stewart and Rochon, and it was very revealing and relevant as well. Take a look.
Numerous witnesses from the OPP and the OPS have testified that the invocation of the act may have been helpful, but it was not necessary to clear the protests. Would you agree with them on that point?
I believe that the invocation of the act provided very useful tools to law enforcement.
Useful tools, but not necessary tools.
Well, I'm not in a position to render an opinion on that, I don't think. I would only observe, as I've observed already, that upon the invocation of the act and the use of those tools, the protests diminished and stopped. And that goes beyond useful.
Now, the Liberal Research Bureau is an interesting taxpayer-funded entity. We'll talk more about it another time. But here it shows that prior to the Emergencies Act being voted on, the New Democrats were already going to vote in favor of it. However, Stewart claimed that he only learned about the NDP's support of the act, quote-unquote, upon the vote. Finally, another noteworthy moment from his testimony was when Stewart explained that the Emergencies Act is only a tool of last resort and that there were, quote-unquote, many other tools as well.
But specifically with respect to the Emergencies Act, would you, based on your understanding of the discussions that took place around that, in your view, would the Emergencies Act have been an appropriate tool to deal with the situation in Ottawa had it not been for those other events?
The Emergencies Act is generally considered to be a tool of last resort under very exigent circumstances, urgent, time-limited. So there were many other tools in the toolkit. Indeed, Ontario used one, and it was not used until quite a bit later in time. So I would say, we were all conscious of it as being a tool, but in the minds of those who were, discussing it with counterparts, there were other tools as well.
My colleague Celine Gallus also asked a question to Stewart. Check it out right after his testimony.
Mr. Stewart, you admitted that the Emergencies Act was the wrong decision. In hindsight, what would have been the right decision?
Well, there you have it, folks. Here's everything that you need to know about what went on during this extremely interesting and very revealing day. Make sure to stay tuned because, well, I'm telling you, the remaining testimonies will be as interesting as this one. And we'll make sure to bring you the best coverage that we can. For Rebel News, this is William Diaz. Support our independent coverage of the Emergencies Act inquiry. There's 2 weeks left. If you want to support us, you can go to truckercommission.com and make a donation.